In the morning of June 11, 1964, three girls were walking along a rural road near Sister Lakes, Michigan, when a large dark figure came out of the woods and crossed ahead of them on two legs. Joyce Smith reportedly saw it first and fainted, while Patsy Clayton got the clearest look, and later accounts placed the figure near 7 feet tall, dark-faced, and unlike any person she recognized. Gail Clayton apparently saw less clearly, yet the report reached police within minutes. Hours earlier, deputies had spent most of the night controlling roads packed with armed strangers who believed the same creature was hiding somewhere around Dewey Lake. Roughly 200 people had reportedly arrived, carrying rifles, shotguns, knives, tire irons, and other weapons, turning an unidentified animal report into a public safety crisis, before anyone had proved that an unusual animal existed. Authorities searched, residents watched their farms, hunters crowded the roads, and still, nobody produced a body, a clear photograph, or a track capable of identifying what people were seeing. Stranger still, the story had not begun with the girls or the armed crowd, because reports of something unusual in the area apparently existed before the media frenzy. If panic created the monster, why were people describing something strange before the panic had time to create anything? Sister Lakes was not remote wilderness, where an enormous animal could roam for years without meeting people. Farms, orchards, berry fields, houses, wooded roads, and wetlands sat close together around Dewey Lake, making the basic contradiction harder, rather than easier. Newspaper-based reconstructions say unusual reports may have circulated as early as 1962, although those older claims became public after the 1964 outbreak and deserve caution. Contemporary United Press International coverage said roughly 10 reputable people had reported the creature by June 11. Descriptions varied, but unusual size, dark hair, upright movement, and reflective or glowing eyes appeared often enough to keep returning. Nobody had shown, with any certainty, that all of those witnesses saw one animal, yet something had already happened before the story became entertainment. Before we go deeper, like the video, subscribe, and support the channel. If you enjoy investigations where the monster has to survive the evidence before it gets a souvenir stand. Our algorithmic offering is complete, and we can get back to the woods. Tuesday, June 9th, is where the documented outbreak begins, at Evelyn Utrup's farm south of Dewey Lake. Utrup summoned Cass County deputies after reporting disturbing activity, and later said she believed something had once chased her toward the house. Careful reconstruction suggests she had not actually seen the creature clearly, even though contemporary coverage later attached dramatic details to her account, showing how quickly a frightening report could become more specific in print. Around the same time, seasonal farm workers arrived and gave the case its first major visual encounter. Gordon Brown, 25, was there with his 17-year-old wife Mary, his brother Randall, and a neighboring girl, when they reportedly noticed a large figure between a barn and a shed. Rather than immediately deciding they had found a monster, Gordon and Randall obtained a flashlight and followed the shape for roughly 300 yards. According to Gordon's account, as reconstructed from contemporary newspapers, the brothers eventually thought they were looking at a tree, standing where no tree had been before. Only after watching it, did they become convinced that the dark vertical shape was the same figure they had followed, now standing motionless, and that was when they retreated. Several later summaries described the Browns' creature as roughly 9 feet tall, perhaps 500 pounds, covered in dark hair, with a dark face, and eyes that appeared to glow. Such dimensions were witness estimates made at night, not measurements from a captured animal. Brown later rejected the idea that he had mistaken a bear for something larger, while Mary drew what she believed she had seen for a Chicago newspaper. Neither certainty nor a sketch identifies an animal, but several people at one property were now reporting something unusual. All before the story reached its chaotic phase. Near the same property, deputies found an impression in sandy ground, important enough for a plaster cast. Reported measurements put it at about 3 3/4 inches across the heel, and 6 inches across the middle. Unfortunately, loose soil preserved too little detail to identify what made it, leaving police with an impression, rather than proof of any particular animal. Wednesday, June 10th, introduced the force that would soon become more dangerous than whatever might have been in the woods. Benton Harbor radio coverage reportedly gave Liz tenors the mistaken impression that Cass County authorities wanted public help stalking the creature. Toward evening, carloads of curious people were moving into the area, some from outside Michigan, and many were armed. Deputies, who had hoped to investigate the reports, instead found rural roads clogged with vehicles, while strangers carried shotguns, rifles, knives, tire irons, and other weapons through the darkness. Officers spent the night directing traffic, calling auxiliary deputies, requesting help from neighboring Van Buren County, and persuading armed civilians to leave. Press coverage treated the disruption seriously enough for the Detroit News to put the chaos on its front page. Reportedly, one hunter fired twice at a black Shetland pony, after mistaking it for the creature, fortunately missing both times. That mistake proves nothing about the original sightings, but it shows expectation changing perception. In real time. Close to 3 in the morning, the crowds finally began to thin, which should have been when the story started collapsing under its own absurdity. Barely 6 hours later, however, Joyce Smith and sisters Patsy and Gail Clayton were walking along a wooded road when they reported that something emerged from the trees and crossed ahead of them. Soon afterward, Joyce reportedly fainted, the others helped revive her, and the girls reached a nearby house to contact police. Patsy apparently had the best view, yet surviving accounts do not preserve her description consistently. Later reconstruction says Patsy thought the animal looked somewhat like a bear, while another version, drawn from several 1964 newspapers, describes something about 7 feet tall, black-faced, and not human. Choosing whichever description makes the better monster would hide the most useful part of the evidence, because the disagreement shows how eyewitness history can shift when newspapers summarize one frightening event. Whichever account is closer, a young witness in daylight believed a large dark animal crossed the road, and police searched the area again. Searchers found no creature, no clear trail, and nothing that allowed authorities to identify what had been reported. Repeated failure creates a problem for the extraordinary interpreter. Tashan, because an animal 7 to 9 feet tall should be difficult to hide around active farms, once police, residents, and hundreds of visitors are looking for it. Failure to capture one proves little across woods, wetlands, crop fields, and private property. But every promising clue weakened under inspection. Why did the report sound so specific, while the physical evidence remained so vague? Friday, June 12th, brought another example, when Robert Walker of Dewey reported large tracks near Dewey Lake that he considered ape-like. Walker also said he had seen the creature the previous summer, but had kept quiet, which would matter if independently confirmed. Subsequent impressions reportedly looked more like dog tracks to deputies, showing how ambiguous marks could gain importance once the area expected a monster. Meanwhile, the story was becoming measurable in ways the creature never was. Local businesses sold monster-themed food, drinks, and hunting kits, while beer distributor Jack Handley offered a $1,000 reward before Sheriff Robert Doole persuaded him to withdraw it. Reports described berry pickers refusing to enter fields, and some families leaving, giving an unverified animal real consequences. Once that cycle begins, later sightings become harder to treat as independent evidence. Briefly, a black animal rising on 2 legs can become the creature heard about on the radio, reflected light can become glowing eyes, and an ordinary track can become an ape print. None of that requires dishonesty, because expectation can change interpretation before memory reshapes the story. Yet suggestion cannot easily explain an encounter reported before people knew what they were supposed to see. Precisely because of that contamination, the June 9th cluster matters more than the hundredth person who drove into Sister Lakes after hearing about a monster. Assuming Utrop's concerns, the Browns' sighting, and the impression arose before publicity reached full force, something triggered the story, even if later reports became contaminated by attention. Dismissing everything as headline-driven hysteria skips the part that produced the headlines. Among conventional explanations, a black bear remains the strongest candidate because it connects directly to several details witnesses reported. University of Michigan zoologist William H. Burt reportedly considered a bear plausible and noted that one standing upright might reach roughly 5 or 6 feet. Dark fur fits the Brown's description, eyeshine can resemble glowing eyes, and temporary upright posture could make an animal appear human. Farmers near the swampy area had also reportedly seen bears before, making the species plausible. However, placing that explanation beside the Brown brothers' account exposes the part it does not resolve neatly. Both brothers reportedly followed the figure for hundreds of yards, later insisted it was not a bear, and described something they believed remained upright long enough to resemble a misplaced tree. Nighttime distance and posture can be misjudged, while frightened witnesses can become more certain, without becoming more accurate. But those limitations explain uncertainty, rather than the specific sequence the brothers described. Another suggestion came from University of Michigan zoology professor Frank Eggleton, who reportedly floated an escaped gorilla. An ape could fit the dark face, hair, and upright appearance in some descriptions, but investigators apparently found no report of a missing zoo or circus gorilla. Michigan winters also make a multi-year escaped gorilla scenario difficult, if the older reports are accepted. Any theory requiring an exotic animal to escape unnoticed, remain undocumented, survive, and disappear again, asks far more than the bare explanation. Hoaxing can account for part of the outbreak, without explaining the whole sequence. Within days, another Michigan monster scare was exposed, after an officer pursued a supposed creature, and evidence associated with a disguise was recovered. Teenagers were also reported to have joined the Sister Lakes excitement. Proving a later costume hoax does not prove the Browns followed a man in one on June 9th. Mass suggestion explains much of the later wave, after radio broadcasts, newspaper coverage, and armed searches taught everyone what the creature was supposed to resemble. It works badly as a complete solution, because it arrives too late to create the earliest reports, which existed before the community had a shared monster template. Strip away the armed visitors, merchandising, rumors, copycats, and later retellings, and the case becomes smaller, but more interesting. Named witnesses reported unusual events, deputies responded, an impression was examined, and daylight witnesses generated another search, without producing evidence of an unknown species. Skepticism changes the question, from whether Bigfoot was in Michigan, to what ordinary sequence could produce persistent reports, without decisive proof. Simplest of all, there may never have been one cause. Perhaps one witness encountered a bear, another saw a different animal at a poor angle. Later observers interpreted ordinary sights through the circulating story, and pranksters added noise. Newspapers could then weld separate incidents into one creature, making conflicting descriptions exactly what we should expect if people were seeing different things. Public behavior also becomes easier to understand under that explanation. Law enforcement responded because residents were calling, traffic was dangerous, and armed strangers were roaming rural roads, not because the sheriff's department had certified an unknown primate. Commercial attention kept the story alive because disruption produced headlines, and a local monster sold souvenirs without ever needing to be caught. Most revealing of all is how quickly the concentrated outbreak faded. Saturday and Sunday reportedly passed without additional major sightings. The crowds went home, farm work resumed, and the scare diminished within days. Hypothetically, an unknown primate supposed lie living around Dewey Lake for years would make that abrupt silence difficult to explain. Conversely, a temporary animal moving through the area, while media attention created a feedback loop, would make the disappearance exactly what we should expect once the animal moved on and public interest faded. Even that explanation sends us back to June 9th, because the first cluster refuses to disappear with the crowd. Suppose a bear started the chain, Gordon still remained convinced that what he followed was not a bear. Hysteria cannot easily create reports that precede it, while a hoax theory lacks a known hoaxer, costume, or motive tied to the first encounter. Remaining gaps prove nothing extraordinary, but they explain why the case never closes cleanly. Retired Cass County Sheriff Paul Parrish later remembered the episode as one of the strangest periods of his career, while emphasizing that investigators never established what caused the reports, and that some legitimate witnesses had reported something unusual. His recollection sets a useful boundary, because it neither turns police response into proof of a monster, nor dismisses everyone involved as foolish. Something brought deputies to those farms, but investigation never converted that something into an identification. Taken as a whole, the black bear explanation accounts for more of the surviving record, with fewer assumptions than a gorilla, coordinated hoax, or undiscovered ape, although explaining the outbreak is easier than identifying what started it. Media amplification and fear explain why dimensions grew, ambiguous tracks gained importance, reports multiplied, and armed strangers arrived, expecting what newspapers had taught them to see. Multiple causes explain why surviving descriptions refused to line up perfectly, while the rapid end of the outbreak fits an ordinary animal moving on far better than a permanent hidden population. What remains hardest to settle is not the later monster mania, because panic explains much of that surprisingly well. Crucially, the stubborn part is the first cluster around the Utrop farm, before the roads filled with hunters, and before every shadow had acquired a name. Back there, Gordon and Randall reported following a large figure. Several people reported something unusual, and deputies found an impression significant enough to cast, yet none of it became clear enough to identify the source. Maybe an ordinary animal started the chain, and everything human took over from there, or perhaps several unrelated encounters were later fused into one creature, because one monster made a better story than several mistakes. Regardless, the mystery survives, because the earliest evidence remained credible enough to resist ridicule, and weak enough to resist identification. Until someone can explain what happened around that farm on June 9th, without pretending certainty the surviving record does not provide, the Sister Lakes monster remains where the investigation left it, reported, amplified, examined, and never conclusively identified. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next file.